Hello, and welcome back to Checkmate, Atun-Shei, the series where I pontificate profusely about the poor points made by everyone's favorite strawmanning stager, Atun-Shei films. In today's episode, we're looking into Atun-Shei's fourth video in the Checkmate Neigh-Neigh series, which is entitled, Was It Really the War of Northern Aggression? From the title, you can tell that his answer, as we've seen thus far, will be a refutation of this point. As you will start to notice by this point, the title of these videos have the common trend of asking a question about a southern viewpoint, which Atun-Shei tries to dismantle to the best of his ability, usually in a poor fashion. Before we begin analyzing Atun-Shei's response, let's first pause for a moment and ponder the question for ourselves. Was the American Civil War a war of northern aggression? From this, two questions come to the forefront when pondering the argument, which complicate any solid answer. Firstly, what exactly is meant by the term aggression? Secondly, what is the perspective we are focusing on, and how does this impact the answer to the question? These two questions add a considerable amount of variation when giving the answer, as it is rooted in opinion as much as it is solid fact. For a Northerner, the South would be seen as the aggressors due to the singular event at Fort Sumter and for the entire notion of rebelling. For a Southerner, the North would look like the aggressors as they saw themselves as having the right to disassociate and, more importantly, they took an active effort to avert a conflict while the North seemingly instigated the conflict. This doesn't touch upon the question of what is aggression. Before we can proceed with this video, we first need to define what aggression is. In this, all the actions can be summarized into two forms of aggression: proactive aggression and reactive aggression. Proactive aggression is a form of aggression that occurs when one party provokes a situation by taking an action. This ranges from a provocative insult to deliberately placing oneself in a situation that forces a violent response. Reactive aggression is a form of aggression conducted in response to proactive aggression. This ranges from flinging an insult back at the person to dislodging the provoking group out of said location. The key difference between these two is initiation. One is done to deliberately provoke a situation, while the other is done in response to the provocation. With aggression properly defined, we can better analyze the situation during the secession crisis, which will provide much needed context that is near totally lost in Atun-Shei's video. So, with that said, let us begin. The video begins with a relatively interesting surprise. For the first time in this entire series, Atun-Shei doesn't waste my time at the beginning of the video. So, for once, I don't feel the need to have Mr. Neigh-Neigh or Mr. Cow chime in at the beginning of the video.
Aww, but I was feeling the need to roast a weenie.
Does this mean we're not needed for this one? Well, how about you two take a bit of a break while I go through this video? Okay?
Okay.
Sure thing, Mr. Boots. Well, in either case, he begins fairly early on with the main topic of the video, with Johnny Reb proposing a question of why the North invaded the South at the beginning of the war, to which Atun-Shei does answer that they did it to preserve the Union, which quickly changes over to the intro. Shortly thereafter, Atun-Shei adds the stipulation that abolition was not the primary goal of the Union, but that the South unequivocally seceded over slavery, to which he tries to refer to South Carolina. The issue with this statement is it's only a half-truth. Did a number of southern states explicitly mention slavery as a reason for their secession? Yes. This was commonly mentioned in the states that initially seceded, though the context behind why they seceded is itself not as straightforward as they wanted to keep their slaves. The entire reason why the secession crisis began in the first place all comes down to the election of Lincoln, who, rather explicitly, stated that he wished to halt the expansion of slavery into new territories, a power that Lincoln did not have, and an action that was unquestionably a power grab. The southern states that seceded initially made it clear that the reason for why they were mentioning slavery was because of the perceived actions of the North to infringe upon the matter against the South's own wishes, often with attempts at violence, as we see in the case of John Brown's raid at Harper's Ferry. However, this statement does not hold true for the states that seceded later on. More specifically, Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas seceded because of the call for 75,000 troops and Lincoln's aims to quote-unquote crush the rebellion. In Virginia's secession document, they make it very clear that their reason for secession was due to the actions of the administration in attempting to coerce the states that had already seceded through military force and the infringement of the rights that entailed. Their act of secession was done because of the perceived aggression of the North against the South, this being the origin of the quote-unquote War of Northern Aggression perspective of the conflict. Johnny Reb then reads the comment, which I have shown here, to which Atun-Shei responds with the statement that South Carolina seceded before Lincoln was inaugurated as president. He also mentions that Jefferson Davis was made president of the Confederacy 6 days before Lincoln was inaugurated. He states these things as if they have any relevancy to the overall issue or somehow make the South the aggressors. The entire problem is he is ignoring Lincoln's rhetoric up to this point. Lincoln flatly stated that he was going to prevent the expansion of slavery at all costs, which, as already stated before, is a massive overreach for any president. The South's act of secession was done in response to Lincoln's inflammatory rhetoric and explicit desire to infringe upon a power that had been reserved for the states since the beginning of the Republic. Regardless of the moral debate over slavery, it was not in Lincoln's authority to unilaterally dictate domestic policy on something that had a long-standing precedent of being a power reserved for the states and the people to determine. This is a form of proactive aggression, as Lincoln is deliberately instigating a situation through his actions, to which the South reacts to the situation by seceding from the Union. Secession itself is not an act of aggression, but a natural reaction to an environment that has become hostile to one group's interests. Let me provide an analogy to help encapsulate the issue. You are a part of a group of 5 friends who regularly do many things together. At one time, you all had much the same interests in mind. However, you disagreed on where you want to hang out. You and one friend want to hang out at the local store just down the road from where you live. However, your 3 other friends want to hang out at John's house. Initially, you and your friends compromise and hang out at the store one week and then at John's house the other. However, one day, John brings along one of his friends who quickly asserts his dominance, demanding that they hang out at John's house all the time. John and the others agree and decide to use their weight of numbers to make you hang out with them at John's house all the time. However, your friend who wants to hang out at the store objects to this, calling it unfair, and decides he does not want to hang out anymore. Who here is the aggressor? Is your friend acting in aggression by refusing to hang out with them anymore? Or is John's other friend the aggressor for appeasing the majority interest? In the end, it's not your friend's fault for not wanting to associate with the group anymore. His interests have been trampled upon so thoroughly that there is no incentive to hang out with them anymore. He's not acting out of aggression by leaving, but making the sensible decision to exercise his freedom of association to not be forced into whatever the group wants to do. Much in the same manner, the southern states that seceded saw Lincoln's actions for what they were, a deliberate attempt at abusing the system in order to get his way against their interests. In plain terms, Lincoln is trying to force the South into doing what he wants them to do, but the South is not having any of it. After bringing up these 2 points, he goes on to ask the question to Johnny Rep of what he thought the South was up to in the 4 months between their secession and the firing on Fort Sumter. In the back of my mind, I was thinking of the rather obvious answer of preparing for the North to invade them. However, I am not the one answering for myself. What is answering for my stead is his simplistic straw man, Johnny Reb, which he says they were kicking back and relaxing. Following this obvious act of Atun-Shei shoehorning words into people's mouths, he says the following.
January 4th, 1861. Anticipating Alabama's immediate secession, Governor A.B. Moore ordered the state militia to seize federal property at Mount Vernon Arsenal, Fort Morgan, and Fort Gaines, effectively putting Mobile Bay in Confederate control. January 6th, a group of armed men barged into the federal arsenal at Apalachicola, Florida, and demanded the keys to the armory. January 10th, weeks before Louisiana's secession, state militia seized the U.S. arsenal at Baton Rouge on orders from the governor. The following day, they seized Forts Jackson and St. Philip, which guarded the mouth of the Mississippi. January 13th, armed Mississippians took forcible control of the unfinished federal fort on Ship Island in the Gulf. January 24th, Georgia militia seized the Augusta Arsenal. February 8th, acting on orders from the governor, Arkansas militia volunteers seized the federal arsenal at Little Rock and escorted federal troops across March 6th. The Provisional Confederate Congress authorized President Davis to raise an army of 100,000 men for 12 months' service. April 12th, South Carolina militia fired on Fort Sumter. April 15th, President Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers for 3 months' service to suppress the rebellion.
Now, if you take all of this at face value, it does sound like the South were the aggressors. But there's a few issues I was able to dissect from it. When I initially watched this, what lingered in the back of my mind was the rather obvious thought. All of these actions were taken within the state's given territory in the act of defending themselves. For many of these states, they had already seceded or were about to secede, especially in the case of Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana. Having a full-blown arsenal, a place that could easily supply any federal troops that would show up, right in your backyard is going to be a threat to your safety and well-being if you decide to secede from said federal body. These arsenals were the proverbial knives behind their backs, which could have been used to strike at them the moment the federal body chose to act. As a result, having them in their backyard was a threat to their own security, and therefore securing the arsenals was seen as a means to ensure their security. However, the issues with these cited examples runs even deeper than the initial assumptions made. First, we have to take into account what the common trend was during most of these seizures, which, ironically enough, I can use the very sources Atun-Shei referenced against him. For instance, in every single example cited, there was a grand total of 0 deaths that took place. In every single example he cited, not a single person was killed during the entire affair, neither federal troops nor militiamen. The common trend was this: the governor, or secessionist groups within the state, would demand the seizure of the arsenals out of fear of federal troops being sent there. The governor or local militias would be mustered and be stationed next to said arsenals. Upon surrounding the arsenals, they would demand the surrender of the arsenals, which, in every case cited prior to Fort Sumter, the garrison commander, if there even was one, would surrender. By the end of it, the garrison would be sent on their way unharmed, and in some cases would even be admired by the locals for their conduct during the entire crisis. To give a case example cited in the video, we can look at what happened in the Little Rock Arsenal seizure and see this trend exhibited. In late January 1861, the state of Arkansas was going through the secession crisis and were to hold a vote on having a secession convention in February 1861. Prior to the election of 1860, there was no garrison in the Little Rock Arsenal. However, in November 1860, a garrison of 65 men, led by Captain James Totten, was stationed at the arsenal and was there when the secession crisis unfolded. Pro-secessionists in Helena, Arkansas had urged Governor Henry Rector to seize the arsenal before more federal troops would arrive. Governor Rector took a passive role wherein he wouldn't tolerate the garrison at the arsenal destroying the weapons there, though he also didn't claim he had control over the militia units that were being mustered in the southeastern part of the state and were assembling in Little Rock. By February 5th, there were militia units from 9 counties in Little Rock, which were ready to seize the arsenal, using force if necessary. However, the City Council of Little Rock was opposed to any violent seizure and in turn mustered their own militia units to keep the peace during the whole situation. On February 6th, Captain Totten, who had not received any reinforcements and had no standing orders, decided to surrender the garrison rather than risk a bloody confrontation. In the end, his men would be escorted to a ship bound for St. Louis, and he would be presented with a sword by the ladies of the city for his conduct and preventing unnecessary bloodshed. Throughout the entire situation, attempts were made to prevent unnecessary bloodshed. No one was seriously harmed throughout the entire situation, showing a level of self-control and rational thought in an otherwise tense situation. However, it's worth noting the main driving factor through this particular case. The secessionists were motivated to seize the arsenal because of the fear of the garrison being reinforced by federal troops. In fact, that was the common motivation for the seizure of all of the cited examples presented by Atun-Shei. The secessionists took these pseudo-aggressive actions out of the underlying fear that if they did not act, the federal government would send more troops to occupy them and use them to suppress and coerce them back into the Union. This fear is, ironically enough, completely rational. We only need to look at Fort Monroe in Virginia to see this. Fort Monroe was a strategically placed fort at the mouth of the James River, otherwise known as Hampton Roads, that acted as a control point to prevent naval assaults against the naval dockyards in Norfolk. During the American Civil War, Fort Monroe remained in the hands of the federal troops and effectively cut off the Confederate Navy from leaving the James River. More important than that, Fort Monroe served as a major staging ground for the Army of the Potomac for the beginning of the Peninsula Campaign in May 1862. The fort and the surrounding area hosted over 100,000 troops, which would move from the fortress to the outer defenses of Richmond by late May of 1862. Fort Monroe was a key strategic asset that acted as a persistent thorn in the side of the Army of Northern Virginia and Virginia's militia throughout the entire war, as it acted as a major staging ground for the assault against and the attempted subjugation of the capital of the Confederacy and the Commonwealth of Virginia. However, the most obvious reason why these things were done was due to the federal government's actions during the entire crisis and the preceding months. As we see with the Little Rock Arsenal, the federal government was already stationing troops in these arsenals and forts when provided the chance. To add to this, much of it was done as a proverbial slap in the face of the South. The most notable instance would be the situation in Charleston with Fort Sumter, where, in the preceding months before the infamous firing of the fort, Lincoln actively attempted to reinforce the garrison on the island through bold resupply runs to the fort in spite of the South's attempts to find a peaceful solution to the entire affair. It was in response to Lincoln's active efforts to instigate a conflict that, on April 12, 1861, the forces in Charleston had no option but to bombard the fort. an act that resulted in 0 casualties for both sides, with the only death resulting from the entire affair occurring during a freak accident during the surrender of the fort. In no uncertain terms, Lincoln's administration had made a secession crisis into a full-blown civil war by proactively instigating the South into an aggressive reaction. It is because of the conduct and behavior of Lincoln during the entire secession crisis, by intentionally instigating a conflict rather than attempting to alleviate the situation, that a civil war broke out. Both sides did take measures that were aggressive. However, the South actively avoided using violence to ensure their goals were met and only acted in aggression when provoked. The North, by contrast, actively made the situation worse by refusing to defuse the situation and instead actively provoking a response from the South, which they then used to justify raising troops to, and I quote, crush the rebellion. Ergo, Lincoln was acting as an aggressor, thus affirming the Southern viewpoint of the North as the aggressors. However, if you took Atun-Shei's statements at face value, without critically analyzing the situation, you would be misled into believing the South were the aggressors purely due to his grossly negligent representation of these historical events. It is this form of sophistry through the omission of information that makes Atun-Shei's opinions insidious. It is this form of fallacious historical presentation that many thousands of people are suckered into believing everything he has to say, thus making his views a hindrance in any and all historical discussions. It is exactly this faulty reasoning and poor argumentation that I was motivated into making this series to begin with. This drive of mine is only affirmed further by Johnny Reb's reaction to it. Instead of acting like how I would act, critically analyzing the points being brought up and pointing out the glaring flaws in the argument, he reacts by stating that they raided the armories for weaponry to facilitate their peaceful separation. Not only does this highlight a hypocrisy that doesn't exist, but it fundamentally misses the entire point of why the armories were seized in the first place. Weapons were only a tertiary concern, as the state militias had their own armories, military academies, dockyards, and forts of their own, something they'd always had since the inception of the Republic. Rather, the main reason was the underlying fear that the armories would be used as staging grounds for federal occupation and coercion of the southern states back into the Union. What Atun-Shei is doing here is narrative crafting. He is actively shaping how people are to view these events by framing them in a specific fashion rather than fairly representing them within their historical context and providing all the information for what happened and what the results were of these situations. He is creating a narrative, which is truly ironic. A man seeking to destroy a false narrative, inadvertently creating his own false narrative. Atun-Shei is a liar.
Atun-Shei.
You're a liar, and you will spend an eternity on this ship.
After this blatant act of narrative crafting, Johnny Rep brings up Lincoln's suspension of habeas corpus, which leads to an entire discussion over the matter. Atun-Shei brings up the fact that the suspension of habeas corpus is constitutional, to which Johnny Rep brings up the fact that Supreme Court Justice Roger Taney challenged the notion that the president could suspend it and stated that it was only Congress that could do it. In this, Atun-Shei insists that habeas corpus was suspended along the railway lines in D.C., which was necessary for Congress to convene in the first place. In all of this, what is completely ignored is the reason why Supreme Court Justice Roger Taney challenged the entire ruling. In September 1861, Lincoln had the Maryland legislature arrested without trial and held in Fort McHenry. One man who was arrested unlawfully during this was Francis Key Howard, the great-grandson of Francis Scott Key, the man who penned the Star-Spangled Banner after witnessing the bombardment of the same fort his great-grandson would be imprisoned within for 14 months. The legislature was arrested, without trial and without proper warrant, and imprisoned for a duration of time. It was this incident that provoked Justice Taney to challenge Lincoln's authority to unilaterally arrest people based entirely on the suspicion of, and I quote, pro-Confederate sympathies. Contrary to what Atun-Shei stated, it wasn't confined to the railway system, but included the entire state of Maryland due to an undercurrent of neutrality within the state legislative body. A body that was opposed to waging the war Lincoln wanted. This is yet another example of Atun-Shei deliberately leaving out key bits of information that add a whole other meaning to the situation. Lincoln, in this case, was acting completely out of his authority and knew he had done so. It is why he sought desperately to get the authority to do so by Congress, which they eventually granted in 1863. After stating this, he goes on to argue that the curtailing of rights in the South was worse, which he lists a number of things, including the restriction of the sale of liquor, a conscription law, and several cases of them suspending habeas corpus. These things did happen, and without the context provided, they do sound worse. However, we need to look at the source material he is referring to in this case, which happens to be a website I occasionally refer to for my own videos, the Encyclopedia of Virginia article discussing the curtailing of civil liberties. Some of these laws mentioned were enacted on the state level, such as Virginia's own military draft, as well as Confederate laws and regulations. Some laws, such as the curtailing of the sale of liquor, were enacted not because they wanted to enact such laws, but as a wartime necessity, as the production of alcohol consumed valuable grain necessary for the war effort. In fact, the food security issue in the South was a pressing issue, which led to several incidents in Richmond, such as the infamous Bread Riot of 1863. This incident, which took place on April 2nd, 1863, saw the lower-class women of the city take to the streets and break into stores to steal food, clothing, and other items. Many of the laws, including the suspension of habeas corpus in the South, were done in places, such as Virginia, because of the up-close and personal nature of the conflict there. When towns exchanged hands numerous times, and the constant warfare being waged in the area, harsh measures were required in order to maintain order in a situation that could otherwise become completely chaotic. Finally, and most importantly, the same article refers to the actions of the Union in Virginia as well, which isn't much better as they also arrested people without trial, curtailed their rights, and went as far as confiscating property from people who were suspected of being sympathetic to the South. In the end, all Atun-Shei is doing here is playing a game of whataboutism, and to top it all off, this is nothing more than a red herring, a deflection from the original intended question of the video. In fact, from this point onwards, the video has absolutely nothing to do with the question he was intending to answer. Instead of addressing the intended question of the video, whether the war was a war of northern aggression or not, he instead opts to discuss Lincoln who, regardless of his intentions, still acted in a fashion that only made the entire situation worse. Then he discusses the issue of slavery and its roles in the conflict, which, again, has no relevancy to the original question of the video. However, if there is anything to take from what amounts to 2/3 of the video, it is that he has a severe lack of self-awareness. At one point, he claims that the people like quoting Lincoln out of context and like to dredge up quotes without putting the sufficient amount of research into them. Yet, He's the same man who intentionally omits key bits of information that completely change the overall appearance of the war in a fashion that makes the South look like the bad guys. It's the seeming lack of self-awareness of his deficiencies that bewilders me. All the while, he's doing stuff that is distracting. At one point, Johnny Reb brushed up against his mic, which obscures what Atun-Shei is trying to say. At another point, he belches into his microphone. Then, at a third point, he attempts to sing John Brown's Body, which is the most grating thing imaginable, after mentioning how, initially, the North disliked him until the minority of abolitionists made him into a hero, even though John Brown was a pretty rubbish person. In fact, I made a video a few months back discussing John Brown's raid and how the entire idea was a terrible one. In the end, none of this is worth responding to because it is nothing more than one massive series of deflections from the original topic of the video. In a 17-minute long video, he spends 4 minutes talking about the intended topic of the video, 2 minutes discussing habeas corpus in the North and South, and 11 minutes on Lincoln and slavery. And yet, we haven't discussed the end of this video. However, I think I'm going to need a little bit of help for this one. Hey, Mr. Neigh-Neigh, Mr. Cow.
Yes?
Hey, Mr. Neigh-Neigh, where's Mr. Cow?
Sleeping?
Okay, can you wake him up for me?
Okay. Mr. Cow. Hey, Mr.
Okay.
Mr. Cow. Mr. Cow!
Bloody Nora!
Boots wants to see you.
I was having a wonderful dream.
Hey, what was it about?
Nothing in particular.
Okay.
Okay, you two. I want for you guys to watch this skit and tell me what you think. Mr. Boots, I died the last time that happened. I know, but, this shouldn't be a terminal case of cringe. I think. So, shall we begin? Play the video, Boots.
It's in the song, right? John Brown's body lies moldering in the grave. John
really don't
Brown's
have to give
body
us a
lies
performance,
moldering
Billy
in
Yank.
the grave. John Brown's body lies moldering in the
must
grave,
insist.
but his
Stop
soul
with that
goes
damn
marching
noise.
on. Glory, glory, hallelujah.
Shut up.
Glory,
Stop
glory,
singing. Stop that damn noise.
hallelujah.
Stop.
Glory,
Lord have
glory,
mercy.
hallelujah.
Shut up.
And his
Shut up.
soul goes marching on.
Was he singing?
Yes. Yes, he was. Yes, he was.
Boots, could you sing for me?
I don't think I should.
Come on, Boots. Just one verse.
I don't think I can sing, but I could play the Dulcimer for you.
Okay, just do that. Wow! That was amateurish!
Thanks, Mr. Neigh-Neigh, for your compliment.
Nah, that was a thinly veiled insult.
Moving on. With a bit of time to skip, granted.
Well, you Yankees are just uncultured and basically miserable. That's the main difference between us. As our glorious president Jefferson Davis once said in a speech at the Mississippi State Capitol,
Our enemies are a traditionalist and a homeless race. From the time of Cromwell to the present moment, they have been disturbers of the peace of the world. Gathered together by Cromwell from the bogs and fens of the north of Ireland and of England, they commenced by disturbing the peace of their own country. They disturbed Holland, to which they fled, and they disturbed England upon their return. They persecuted Catholics in England, and they hung Quakers and witches in America.
and clearly the apple does not fall far from the tree. Oh, Oh! Thou art an unlearned swine if thou dost truly believe that papists, Quakers, and witches ought to be shown mercy. But religious freedom is one of the founding principles. The devil's tongue wags in thy mouth. Those who love the Lord must needs separate themselves entirely from the professors of heathen faiths.
Hey, look! It's my neighbor from Boston, Mr. Crow.
Oh, not him! I don't like his accent. Mr. Crow?
Oh, who's bad-mouthing me? And I ain't from Boston, I'm from Baltimore! Call!
Wait, how did you get in here?
I'm a crow, you idiot! I fluttered into your room and sat on the padded bust of your head!
Oi, that's rude of you.
Call! Who's you to tell me that?
No one invited you here.
What? Call! I
thought you were doing your house. Tell you what I want to do. What do you think you're talking about? Shut up! Shut it!
You alright, Bootsy?
Yeah. Sleep deprivation is getting to me. Let's get this over with before I lose my mind.
You know, that's not a bad point. Mixed communities are a disaster. Usually it's just one community getting to the top anyway. Communities are better kept separate, or at least totally homogeneous. Just so that way they can preserve their race, identity, and culture. If you ever noticed, mixed communities look just like New York City and have no identity. Bastardizing anything unique. Devilry!
Is he? Yes. Yes, he is.
Wow! What a weenie! I like the uniform!
Anyways, let's finish this up.
My God. I have returned. You have brought me to the Valley of Izion, where I live in the depths but see in the ice, ending by mountains of sin, I behold your glory. You have no power here, which finds a general. I will draw thee out, Satan, as poison is drawn from a wand.
If I go, Johnny Rip dies.
Thou hast not killed me. Thou shalt not kill him.
The South is mine. Revenge!
My work here is done. Okay, what happened? Hey man, are you okay? You fucking stupid to compare a Nazi to a Confederate. That's Yankee propaganda teaching you more lies. Good to have you back, buddy. Southerns treated African American maybe better in some cases. I know they were bad treated, but you think U.S. Grant treated them better them days. LMAO.
What did I just watch? Honestly, I don't know. Well, that was disappointing. I'm head up, Bootsy. Yeah, you guys can go. I think I want to discuss this last part by myself.
This entire video was a monumental waste of time. All it can be described as was one massive deflection from the main point it allegedly answered, but never really did. Not only did he lie through omission, but then he deflected and somehow still managed to shoehorn slavery into a video talking about a specific viewpoint of the war. And then, when I thought it would just be a massive handout of disappointment, he throws in a final series of insults to the audience it is meant to convince by taking a singular comment and deriving that the Confederacy were tied to our favorite Austrian painter's ideology of choice. It may not have been as overtly insulting as the first two videos, but it shows exactly where he's going with all of this. Was the war a war of northern aggression? When we take all of the facts into consideration, then the North does not come out the other side as the innocent victims, but as facilitators of the conflict by agitating the South into a violent response. The South made every attempt to avoid armed conflict while still ensuring its security, seeking to avoid unnecessary bloodshed at all costs. Yet, this question of whether one group were the agitators or not does not matter. In the end, the war was, is, and will always be a tragedy, where multiple people failed on multiple accounts to prevent the war. In the end, I don't seek to label either side as truly good or truly evil. Both sides were filled with innocent men who lost their lives in that terrible civil war. We ought to remember this, take this to heart, and come to love these men, not despise them. Love thy enemy as you'd wish to be loved, and may God bless all of you.